right, folks, we'll get started. Welcome to the Lunch, Learn, Link seminar. We have had one presentation already this year that we shared with the Department of Environmental Health. And I'm happy to tell you we have another speaker from the Bloomberg School of Public Health Department of Environmental Health and Engineering, Dr. Anna Rule. Dr. Rule is actually a graduate of Johns Hopkins School of Public Health and is really the backbone of our study of electronic cigarettes and their products and the new developments as they occur. So for some of you, you may have seen an article that's featured on the front page of the School of Public Health's website now. I encourage you to go there. There are, Anna is mentioned and highlighted, and as is the Global Tobacco Institute. So I'll say welcome to our internet audience, and I would like to let you know that this lecture is being recorded and will be available online, so we will let you know when that occurs. Thank you so much for coming, and after the lecture, Nicole is handing out tickets for pizza, so we have pizza in the gallery immediately following. So with that, I turn it over to Anna Rule.
Thank you, Norma. Thanks, everybody, for being here. Oh, thank you. I hope I deserve that. So, yeah, when Norma invited me to speak today, we had no way of knowing that Juul and vaping was going to be all over the news this week. So that was, I guess, some foresight on Norma's side. So I'm going to talk about emerging risks of e-cigarette use and vaping in general, but I'm going to talk in particular about our study, which is focused on metals. And yeah. So I'm going to put this up here, if I can. Sorry. All right. So many of you may be aware that e-cigarette use is increasing, especially in the United States, and particularly among two groups that are of importance for public health. One is cigarette smokers, and the other one is young adults who have never smoked. So it's a little update that I found this morning that just Juul, which is one of the many e-cigarettes that I'll talk about, had a 641% increase between 2016 and 2017. So to give us a little scope of what's all the hubbub about. So e-cigarettes in general, the term e-cigarette and what we now know as e-cigarettes have been in the market since 2004, which is not a lot of time. So to understand all of the health effects and all of the long-term effects that vaping or consuming these e-cigarettes can have. The research has just begun to establish most of the toxic chemicals in e-cigarettes, but the research community and the environmental health community has known for many years about the health effects of most of these compounds, such as nicotine, aldehydes, tobacco-specific nitrosamines, PAHs, VOCs. It's not me. There is particular concern about the exposure to metals because metals are an integral part of the electronic cigarettes, as I will show in a little bit. The juice, the liquid that is used to generate the aerosol is directly in contact with the metal. So the FDA has been trying to play catch up a little bit, although it took a while to get started. It released on August 2016 the first rule. Is called the deeming rule that regulates e-cigarettes and their components the same as they regulate cigarette products. And I'm sorry that it's cut. I don't know if I can do anything about that. But we think that information about the potential leaching of metals into the aerosol could be a very important piece of information for FDA to for the regulatory efforts. So a little more on the deeming rule. The rule was finalized in August 2016. And like I said, it extends the regulatory authority that they already had for cigarettes to all nicotine products. So it includes e-cigarettes, but also hookahs and, I guess, heat-not-burn, other devices. However, the rule does not restrict the use in public places. That is state by state done. So I found a 2017 report that lists 12 states and over 600 local laws that restrict the use of e-cigarette indoor. However, Maryland does not have a state ban. So it goes by localities. And so Baltimore City has actually a ban, but Baltimore County doesn't. And so this will be important, as I'll show in a little bit. And so, as many of you may know, electronic cigarettes have had like a whirlwind of explosion, and not only in the use, but also in the evolution of the device. And so initially, and I don't know if I have, yes. So initially, they were meant to look like cigarettes. They were meant to replace the cigarettes. So they are called cigalikes, this first generation. And some of them were like, they really wanted to look just like cigarettes. And so you may see that it looks like I have a cigarette there, but it's an electronic cigarette. And then they started to quickly change and incorporate colors and different feels. They quickly evolved in about a couple of years into this second generation that were called pens. And I think because they resemble a pen. The main difference between these two is that here the liquid that is going to generate the aerosol is all enclosed. It's a black box for the user. The user only had to charge the device and then just generate the aerosol. With the pens, you actually had a tank that you could refill. So this was the first devices that could actually change the liquid in that tank and modify the feel or the flavors, that kind of thing. The nicotine content also. And then from there, a couple of years of really heavily, I would say, heavy engineering and very innovative things happened that they suddenly realized they didn't have to look like cigarettes. They actually was an advantage to not look like cigarettes because people were looking for, like there were cigarette bans and you couldn't smoke in places. So it was actually an advantage that they didn't look like cigarettes. So they went as far away from a cigarette as they could, and they became these big boxes. And however, the backbones or the insides of the devices are very, very, very similar. It's the same thing. They have a battery. In this case, the battery is here. In this case, the battery is here. But it's the same thing. They have a container that has the liquid that is in contact with the coil. And in this case, it's very obvious. It's transparent, and it's called a tank. But in these cases, they were called cartomizers. They came like that, and like I said, you just changed that piece with a coil, and then the battery you could keep and reuse. And then the FDA, when these were like the rage and what most people were using up until like 2016. And then when the FDA rule came about, a lot of the vendors started to decrease their sales. And somehow this company called Juul out in California figured out that the part of the problem was that these big devices were generating plumes, and it was very obvious, very easy to detect. So they re-engineered to look a little more like the first generation, like the cigalikes. It's an enclosed system, so again, you don't have access to the liquid and the tank. You don't have access to the control of the voltage either, which you did with those. And so these go a little bit back to the first generation, and so the way that people are now referring to them are the closed systems, which include the first and the fourth generation, and the open systems, which include a tank that you can actually modify. And I will show in a minute. So this is just came out 2 days ago in JAMA. It's a report compiled by the CDC looking at trends of cigarette, and I can't see it, but this cigarette use, cigarette sales. So this is unit sales in the US by manufacturer. So you can see that if you entered the research community looking at electronic cigarettes in 2013, it was a completely different scenario that we have today. These other devices were actually the more prominent, which included some of those big, that are called mods, modified devices or modifiable devices. Japan tobacco has not increased much over the years, but if you see British American tobacco realized soon around 2014 that they were missing out. So they did a very intensive marketing campaign, and they caught up until, that were right around there in the middle of 2015, this Juul company came into the market, and you can see the explosive, and this only ends at the end of 2017. This graph, it has shot up farther than that. This is about 30% of the market, and right now it's at 65% of the market by the end of 2018. So, so what are these Vape-Pods? These, like I was mentioning before, were introduced in 2015. By the end of 2017, they had 30% of the market, and by now they have almost a little more than 60%. There's a couple of characteristics about these devices that are very appealing to the younger generation. One of them is that it's pretty small. It's shaped like a USB drive. I don't think this is a coincidence. It's a small and easy to disguise. It has the same components as the other cigarettes. It has the battery and the juice and the coil. They are sold in very sleek and colorful designs. The second thing is that they generate an aerosol that is very thin. It's not very obvious. It's not like these big plumes that you see. I'm sure everybody has seen somebody walking down the street or even on their cars, and they see this big plume. That's generated by these bigger devices with the big batteries. These actually have very, very thin, very stealthy aerosol. And some of the flavors that they have been, actually Juul has very few flavors. They once in a while come with new flavors, and they advertise as like limited edition, get them as you can, and then they take them off of the market in a couple of months. So they generate these craze for the new flavors. But the typical flavors that they have been selling are tobacco, fruit medley, cool mint, and mango. This is one of the things that the FDA began to get very concerned, because these are clearly very appealing to the younger generation. And so one of the reasons that the electronic cigarettes had been evolving so rapidly into these big tank devices that generated big plumes was because the original cigalikes did not deliver the amount of nicotine that the cigarette smoker required. And so the cigarette smokers initially were trying to quit via the electronic cigarettes, but they were finding that they were not getting the nicotine that they needed. And that's the main problem with the smokers, is that they're addicted to the nicotine. And so these devices have actually gone around that problem by changing the chemistry in the liquid inside them. So these, instead of the free-base nicotine that had been used previously, they now use what are called nicotine salts. So they can concentrate even further the nicotine in the device. And so they claim that the blood nicotine from one puff of one of these devices is equivalent to what you would get with a normal cigarette. Because, as you may know, Juul has since the beginning said that they are not marketing to kids, they are only marketing to the cigarette smokers so that they can quit. So each pod contains 59 milligrams per milliliter of nicotine. And in our study, we asked our participants to tell us what concentration of nicotine, and the highest that we found was actually 26 milligrams per milliliter. So you can see it's a huge increase in nicotine compared to the previous devices. And this is definitely one of the problems that is now getting addicted, the younger generation that are smoking or vaping these things. And so as I was saying, they are very sleek devices, very cute, many colors, many different feels, but as you can see, this is one of the pods that you interchange with the liquid. It's the same thing. You can see the coil in the middle, and you can see the liquid surrounding the coil that will be heated up to generate the aerosol. So we got interested in this because we have a metals lab, and so we were wondering, might these metals that are in contact with the liquid go into the aerosol and inside and be inhaled by the user? And so the main coil components are, or alloys that are used are nichrome, which is a very common heating element, tantal, and stainless steel. And nichrome is composed of nickel, chromium, and nickel and chromium mostly. Tantal, it has iron, chromium, and aluminum. And stainless steel is chromium, nickel, and manganese, and some carbon. So they're very complex alloys, but most of them have these components. And chromium is a known, I'll come to it in a second, but it's a known carcinogen. So we were interested in that. And here I just have some of the different tanks and ways in which people are generating the aerosols. So chromium, especially hexavalent chromium, is a potent inhalation carcinogen. EPA has said that the classification of chromium-6 as a carcinogen raises concern of the carcinogenicity of chromium-3. And especially because even if all the chromium in the aerosol were trivalent or chromium-3, the oxygen-rich environment of the lungs, when you're inhaling it, has the potential of oxidizing that to hexavalent chromium. So it's still not known, and we are trying to look into this, but this is one of our main concerns about chromium. And then nickel is actually a known human carcinogen in most of the forms, and IARC has classified it as group 1 carcinogen. Then lead, even though we were not lead is not one of the components in the electronic cigarettes. We figured maybe there's some soldering or other metal components of the device. And so as we know, lead is a neurotoxic, and it also has cardiovascular effects, nerve disorders, kidney disease, and fertility problems. So you don't want that close to young adults. And then finally, manganese, which is a known component of some of these alloys, is also an inhalation toxicant. It's known to generate this Parkinson-like disease in welders. It's called manganism. And also it's of concern because it oxidizes some of the chromium that can be in the components. So it would help to transfer this chromium-3 into chromium-6. So our introduction to vaping, when we started when we decided to recruit, we were made aware that there were these things called the vaping conventions. And so we decided to go to one. And we were not expecting to see what we saw. It was really mind-blowing, especially because when we got to the venue, and we got there early, I'll show you in a minute, but because we wanted to do some air sampling, so we got to the venue early, and we found those signs that said, no smoking, including e-cigarettes and all other smoking devices. So as people start coming in, people start clearly using their devices. But some point in the afternoon, they have this weird thing where on the loudspeaker, somebody says, close all the doors and windows, and let's have fun. And everybody with a device puffs out, and you can't breathe. It's more the smell. It's a fruity kind of sweet smell that was getting to us after a while. Everybody else was vaping, so we were like the odd ones. So what we did was to measure the air quality, and I didn't realize these were animated, so I'll just move ahead. We took some. We had some students, which we always do, thankfully, available. And so we devised a sampling strategy, and they took the sampling equipment inside a backpack and carried around the convention center. So we were emulating the personal exposure of somebody at the convention center. And so we measured PM10. And the main reason we decided to do PM10 instead of PM2.5 is because we could see clearly the aerosol. So we figured this is a little larger particles than just PM2.5. And it's still relevant for inhalation, so we decided to do that. So we took a real-time monitor. It's called the side pack. That is used in many cigarette studies. And we also used a filter based with an inlet that's PM10. So we also took some air nicotine devices that we assemble here in our lab. And we used some as passive devices, but the flow rate is not strong enough, so we decided to attach some to filters to a sampling pump. So at 3 liters per minute. And then we had just acquired a multi-gas monitor, so that was very convenient. And that measures total volatile organic compounds, carbon monoxide, nitrogen dioxide, and carbon dioxide. So some indications of air quality and the volatile compounds, which we hypothesized would be present because of the components of the electronic cigarettes. So some of the results are summarized in this graph. And some of the things that I want you to notice is that we started the equipment outside of the venue and then moved inside. And then every couple of hours, we had a different team of people carrying the backpack. So they would come out, transfer the backpack. So in that time, transfer of the backpacks, the equipment was still working. So you can see going back to baseline, and then once they were inside, and then outside, and then inside. And then we had 1, 2, and 3 here, and then the 4. So outside of the venue, inside of the venue. Then when they were doing some trick compositions, which is something like this. So people have like these cute little clouds, so they make like little puffs, or in this case, he makes like a big circle and then small circles that go inside the circles, and they chase them, and it's called cloud chasing. It's quite entertaining, I have to say. And then the big event of the night is this vaping competition, when 2 guys face against each other, and on the count of 3, generate the biggest, densest, longest plume that they can. And you can see this guy's plume over here, this guy's plume going over there. There's a measuring, scale in the background. And so there's judges in the front, and they started eliminating people, like this guy who had the longest plume, then the next pair, and that kind of thing. And this is when the smoking competition was happening. So they are really intense events, and it's kind of like a cult thing. Throughout the afternoon, you hear on the loudspeakers people saying, "We're saving the world because we're saving smokers. Smokers are going to be, healthy from now on because they're moving to our devices." Or at least that was happening 2 years ago when we did this. I have no idea what the narrative is today. But so as we can see, this is not harmless. And the volatile organic compounds, we did not speciate the compounds, but there have been people that have. And there's a couple of papers in the literature that have found formaldehyde, acetaldehyde, choline, toluene, many compounds that are known toxic. So not necessarily harmless. And then the PM10 and nicotine, which are not real time, they were like integrated in a filter. We found nicotine at higher concentrations than what has been reported in some bars. And I think this was one of the hookah bars studies that we did here at the school. But as you can see, just the nicotine, if you're not concerned about anything else, just the nicotine concentrations in the air are of concern. PM10, there's a lot of controversy because it's not really solid particles, so I don't think PM10 is most of our concern anyway. So we went to this vaping convention because we were going to recruit participants so that we can actually look at the exposure of these participants. So we wanted to see the electronic cigarette coils leached metal into the aerosol, and if that aerosol was affecting the exposure of the users. And so, as you can see in second one, we wanted to see using non-invasive biomarkers, such as urine, saliva, and exhaled breath, if we wanted to compare the nickel and chromium concentrations with the use patterns and with the concentrations in the liquid and in the aerosol. And so we had this hypothesis that we would find increased concentrations. So we recruited in 2 waves. We recruited the first year 64 participants and the second year 100 participants. The first year it was I guess our learning curve, but we wanted to recruit vapers, smokers, and non-users. However, our vapers were coming from the convention, so really hardcore vapers. Our smokers, people that we were recruiting, were coming mostly from the community, from around here, around the school. And the non-users were coming from the school, so students. And so the populations were completely different. So there was no way we could compare these populations. So we stopped recruiting smokers and non-vapers, and we decided to just focus on the vapers and try to get, with this small amount of funding that we had initially, tried to get as much as we could and understand about the vapers. And so that's how that went. And then for the second year, we actually got a little more money, a little more savvy, and we actually recruited non-vapers from asking the participants that were vapers to bring friends and family from the community, from their own circle. So they were comparable populations. And so, like I was saying, we recruited at vaping conventions, but also we went to vape shops, which at that time were very popular, but now they're not as many. Tattoo shops, because most vapers have tattoos. We went to colleges, through social media, and Craigslist and newspapers, which actually ultimately ended up being a very good source of recruitment. And we administered an extensive questionnaire because we wanted to know, other than vaping, what other sources of metal exposure they had. So hobbies, if they are welders, or if their job involves metals. So we also collected, like I said, urine, saliva, and exhaled breath condensate. And we collected from the devices that they brought with them. We collected their juice before it was in contact with the device. So we asked them to bring their juice. Then we developed a system to collect the aerosol, and then we collected from the tank after it had been vaped. So we had this before, during, and after, to try to evaluate if the coil was a source of metals. So this device that a postdoc that we had here at the school, most discoveries, was very serendipitous. We were trying to do something else. We had been trying for a couple of months to condensate, cool the aerosol to see if we could put it back into liquid, because we needed as a liquid in order to analyze it on the metals machine, on the ICP-MS that analyzes for metals. And so finally he realized that at the very, very end of the pipette tip that we were connecting to the pump, that's the only place where we are actually getting a little droplet. So So he decided to put pipette tip, little tubing pipette tip, and so we collect a little droplet at the end of each pipette tip, and until you start just collecting, making a bigger droplet and pushing it with the air that's coming from the peristaltic pump. And so you have the cigarette, it pushes the air, and then you get about 500 microliters, depending on the device. So with a big tank modifiable devices, you get a milliliter super easily, but with the smaller pods, you barely get a half a mil, but which is enough for our analysis because unfortunately for the vapor, fortunately for us, concentrations of metals are pretty high. So, so some of the results that we found, first of all, I'll just show you that the prevalence of metals in the different ones, right? So we have the dispenser, the different metals that we found in the dispenser. So notice that by no means is there zero here. We found a lot of metals in the dispenser, even before it's even in contact with the coil. So the flavorings, the colorings, somehow metals are coming in the dispenser. And then most of the ones that had in the dispenser, of course, we found it in the aerosol, and we found it in even higher concentrations in the tank. And so we were looking for chromium and nickel, and we found them, but we were not expecting to find them in the dispenser. But we also were really surprised at that we found arsenic, only in 20%, but still, why is arsenic in there? And lead. And lead is very prevalent in the liquids. So where we find it in the dispenser, we found it in the aerosol, and then in the tank. So that's kind of like a good indication that the metal coil is the source of at least some of the metals. And then we plotted it in this way to show the three different phases, the dispenser, the aerosol, and the tank. And you can see that this progression on all of the metals. You can see that we found in all of them at very, very different concentrations and with a high variability. So some devices have very low concentrations, some devices have very high concentrations. And it's all over the place. But what we did find is that, at least for these metals, every single device had at least some of it in the aerosol. You'll notice that arsenic is not in here because the concentrations were low and we only found it in 20%. So we had decided to get them out of that graph. But that graph, another thing to keep in mind is that this graph is in the liquid. So these are the concentrations that we found in the liquid form of the aerosol. So once the aerosol had been agglomerated back into a liquid. So this does not reflect, it's hard to compare to the health-based standards because the health-based standards for air concentrations are all given in milligrams per cubic meter of air. So lucky for us, we had counted the number of puffs, we knew the puff regime, we knew the volume of air that had been used to generate that aerosol. So we calculated back to what it would be in the aerosol. And so we have for chromium, you can see reflected again here the high variability, but that almost 70% of our samples are above the minimum risk level recommended by the Agency for Toxic Disease Registry from the CDC, ATSDR. So these red ones are the ATSDR MRLs for each of the compounds. And for lead, actually, we have EPA, the National Ambient Air Quality Standards, which is actually an enforceable limit. And half of our samples were above the NACs. So keeping in mind that all of these are long toxicants, we think this is of concern. So looking at the biomarker results, we first have a brief characterization of our participants. So all of them were daily e-cigarette users. So if they were not using daily, we decided to exclude them because we wanted to have a strong signal. So we found that 92% of them of the sole users were also former smokers. So most of our participants had been smokers. And among the never smokers, which was only a handful of them, 80% were under age 25. So an indication of the ones that had never, the younger generation had never smoked and were starting to use electronic cigarettes. The ones that were solely cigarette users and not dual users use lower nicotine concentrations in their devices, which is understandable because they're not addicted to the nicotine, or not as addicted. They owned 3 or more e-cigarette devices. So it's like I was saying, like a collection thing. And they were less likely to report respiratory symptoms than the smokers or the dual users. And then both types of users, the dual users and the sole users, told us that they intended to lower the nicotine concentrations, but they said, when we asked them, are you trying to quit smoking or quit vaping, they said no. That was very clear. Regarding the metals in the biomarkers, and I have to make a clarification here that we have not finished analyzing the second wave, so this is only for the first wave. This is only for 56 of the participants. So some of our associations are not very strong. We think it's because of the small sample size. But we did find some increased nickel concentrations in participants who first vaped very early in the morning, like a good cigarette smoker that is addicted to the nicotine. You have to get your fix as soon as possible. So we found that the sooner you vaped after waking up, the higher concentrations of nickel in the biomarkers. Also the ones that had increased urine cotinine levels, which is an indication of the nicotine in that device. So the more cotinine they had, the higher nickel in their biomarkers. If they changed their heating coil more frequently, we also saw an indication that they had increased. And that was a little bit against of what I had thought. I had thought that the more frequent coil changes would indicate a higher concentrations, but it turns out that apparently it's the newer, sorry, let me take that back. So I thought initially when we started these that the fewer times you change your coil would be the more concentrations, because I thought like the more rusty or degraded that coil would be. But it turns out that it's the newer coils that actually leach more into the liquid. The ones that consume more liquid per week and that smoked at intermediate voltages. So, and I'll show you a little bit a graph that I have about that. And then we also found increased nickel and chromium with increase in aerosol, so which is a good indicator that we are kind of on the right track. However, they're not statistically significant. We think it's because of the sample size. We're hoping that the bigger sample size will confirm this. But so we have here the chromium and saliva, nickel and chromium in saliva by the liquid type. So in the dispenser, you see no association, which is what we expected. In the aerosol, you see a stronger indication in the chromium than in the nickel, but there's something there. And in the tank, we don't know what that is, but there shouldn't be a direct association, but because whatever is in the tank has generated the aerosol, we think that's what that signal is telling us. Then the nickel in urine by the patterns of use. So like I was saying before, with the higher e-cigarette use per week, we have a slightly higher time from waking, cotinine in the urine, and the voltage vape. And this is, I'll show you one for chromium in the next slide. It was very similar. So for some reason, the intermediate voltage is more associated with the higher biomarkers. We think it's potentially because of more efficient combustion at the higher voltage. And then the coil change, as I was saying before. And it's very similar for chromium. You can see except for the time for vaping, we don't know what happened there, but we'll try to corroborate that with our bigger sample size. All of the other ones are very similar. And so when we finished that, Juul was not even in the market. So none of those that I have shown you so far include a Juul. They are mostly modifiable devices. And so we wanted to see if what the difference in the metal concentrations were. So in order to do it relatively quickly, instead of being participant-based, this second part of the study was just in the lab. We got 2 devices from each and did some experiments in the lab. And actually, our colleagues at Columbia University actually did this study. So has just been submitted. I don't remember where. So we evaluated, because it was a controlled experiment in the lab, we now had a little better ability to do by device type, by power, by flavor, and by nicotine content, just to see if any of those affected the metals in the device. So when we analyzed by device type, and I know this is super busy, but you can see the first 2 are the modifiable devices. So the big tank devices are by metal. And the second 2 in each of those graphs are the closed systems. One of them is a Siga-like. The first one is a Siga-like, first generation. And the second one is a Juul. So this last bar that you see on all of them is the Juul. And so you can see that for some metals, it's comparable. We found comparable concentrations, and we only have 9 joules here, whereas there's like around 30 of the others. So that's why you see these big error bars. But for some metals, they've at least eliminated or reduced considerably, like arsenic, iron, tungsten, tin. They're like really, really very, very low in the closed systems compared to the open systems. But for chromium, they're very similar, and for nickel, they're still not negligible concentrations. And then we also analyzed by power, and there's kind of a small indication that by the bigger power you have higher, but it's not very, very clear. We only could do this with the mods because you can't modify the power in the joules. So as you can see, there's not a huge indication, but some of them, and we don't know if it's the type of coil. This is 2 different devices, so we don't know if it's the actual power or if it's the coil. We need to investigate this a little more. By flavor, we also didn't see a big signal. Most of the increase you see here is because of the difference in devices, not necessarily because of the flavor. Within each one, the flavorings have very similar metals. And by nicotine content, again, not a huge difference. So we don't think the nicotine content has any influence on the metal leaching. Like you could see, the metal concentrations varied widely within and between devices, which might be a concern because of quality control, right? It kind of indicates not too great quality control of these devices. We definitely saw higher concentrations in the mods, so the open devices with a tank, than in the closed, like the Juul. Less than 1 order of magnitude for some metals, like aluminum, chromium, and zinc, but up to 2 or more orders of magnitude for some of the other metals. We saw that metal emissions tend to increase with the device power, no influence on the flavors or the nicotine content. So some of the very frequently asked questions that I get are, how do electronic cigarettes compare to cigarettes, and do they reduce the risk? So the first thing that I have to say, that I say every time is, first of all, we did not set out to compare electronic cigarettes to cigarettes. And for smokers, it may be the case that if you're especially a heavy smoker, the concentrations of most of the other components in the e-cigarettes have been shown to be considerably lower, orders of magnitude lower than in the cigarettes. So the National Academy of Sciences, in their report a couple of months ago, actually has a statement that says that it is considered a risk reduction tool for smokers. However, for young vapers that would have never even thought about smoking, this is definitely not a risk reduction. It's increasing their risk. First of all, the right comparison for a non-smoker is ambient air. And concentrations of these things, of any of the toxicants, of the VOCs or PAHs or metals, are higher in these than in ambient air, hopefully. I'm not sure, maybe in Beijing, but here for sure. So for adolescents, vaping represents an increased risk. And a recent study 2 days ago is in JAMA, found an increased risk of vapers of becoming smokers. Up to now, the literature had not been very conclusive on it. Some papers have found that, yes, there was an increased risk of changing to smoking. Other papers have shown no. But there's a pretty comprehensive study a couple of days ago in JAMA that conclusively says these kids, especially if they're using Juul with these high concentrations of nicotine, are getting addicted to the nicotine and are more likely to go back to become smokers. So the fact that Juul is marketing the nicotine the same dose as cigarettes, just if we only base our risk on the nicotine, we can tell that this is not a good idea. They're increasing their risk because nicotine has all these known health effects, on cardiovascular effects, and effects on cognitive function, et cetera. So like I was saying, we only evaluated metals in e-cigarettes, but based on our study and extensive literature on metals, we didn't have to do this to know, because there's a lot of people that have done it in the past. So we tried to compare our results to normal cigarettes. It's really hard because typically metals in cigarettes are reported per cigarette. So there's no per cigarette in an electronic cigarette. You can keep vaping, just refilling with juice and keep vaping. So there's no end, like a cigarette has a finite, and you can count how many cigarettes you smoke. You can't do that with vaping. But in the literature, it has been like a consensus that about 15 puffs of an electronic cigarette is equivalent to 1 cigarette. So based on that, we did the calculation, and we found very similar concentrations for some metals, like chromium, nickel, and zinc, all concerning metals, and lead. And lower concentrations, we almost found no cadmium and very little arsenic. So if you're basing your risk reduction on cadmium and arsenic, maybe you could say that this is, that yes, but I think overall we can see that clearly not. And so, so this is, that's the last slide. I just want to acknowledge first the Cigarette Restitution Fund for their continued support, not just financially, but morally. And all our participants that willingly brought their devices and were subjected to us, asking them questions and telling us about their study. The University of Graz, who have long experience with analyzing metals, so they helped us initially develop the methods and compare our results, and I think gave our paper the validity and the rigor that otherwise it already got a very thorough review and was very harsh comments, but thanks to Graz, I think our credibility increased a little bit. And but most of all, are my amazing team. And unfortunately, nobody. Oh, actually, I see Andres. So one person from this photo is here. In part because they are students and they move to better, bigger things, and in part because they are. They already had other commitments. But thank you for everything, and I will take any questions.
So I will take questions, and I'd like you to use the mic so everybody can hear the question. But thanks so much, Dr. Rule. And for the students in the audience, I think you're here at the beginning of another public health epidemic, perhaps. And I think you'll remember that you were here and hearing about it first from Dr. Rule. Questions?
I guess I preemptively answered the questions.
Hey, thank you for your talk. So I have a health communication question for you. I'm amazed with Juul's advertising power. So Juul is now a verb as well as a noun. It's this self-sustaining advertising campaign where kids will upload viral videos of themselves, and other kids see that on Instagram. How, from a community role model standpoint or from a clinician standpoint, how can one begin to effectively communicate the risks of e-cigs to people who idolize this juuling phenomenon now?
Yeah, I don't. I think this is a multidisciplinary approach. It's gonna need people that have been doing tobacco cessation for years to see what strategies worked. Because the sad thing is that for years we had seen the tobacco epidemic go down. So different strategies had been working. One of these papers that just came out summarizes how due to all of the efforts, smoking had gone from, I think, a prevalence in the youth, from a prevalence of about 20 or 25% in the 90s to 14 or 10% in a couple of years ago, which was pointing to a huge success. But now this has the potential to derail all of that because of the addiction to nicotine. So to answer your question, I don't know, but I think it's going to require every experience that we can possibly have, community organizers and maybe people that have stopped smoking. And very good question.
Hi, Anna. Any concerns about secondhand smoke from vaping?
So there's a few, not very many studies to date, but the first one that I showed in the vaping convention points towards the fact that definitely, I mean, granted it was pretty, intense, a pretty extreme example, but we are concerned that definitely all of these metals can be also found in the environment.
So Anna, a question about the risk reduction strategy among smokers who switch to the smokeless tobacco. Do you have enough data yet on the younger smokers and whether they use flavored Juuls or non-flavored? No.
No, we actually
age,
just got some funding. Yay! to actually recruit Juulers and start looking at these problems. So our new funding is specifically for Juul and also to speciate the metals that we have not been able to so far to say if that chromium is hexavalent or trivalent and if the arsenic is pentavalent or trivalent. Yes.
Thank you for your talk. I was wondering if you could comment at all on the relationship with mental health and e-cigarette use. There's like a pretty well-known fact that people with mental health problems smoke combusted cigarettes at a higher rate than the general population. So I was wondering if you know anything about that, if any research has been done there, or if that's kind of an emerging question at this point.
I think that's a great question. I don't know. The mental health is not my area of expertise, but I think that's a really great area to start looking into. Are these younger adolescents, middle schoolers, and high schoolers, are the ones with a little maybe proclivity to mental health, the ones that are being hooked? But I just got a call from a student in New Hampshire. He read our paper and he's really interested in replicating these because he says his bathroom or the couple of bathrooms in his high school are just like vaping conventions, and so he was worried about it, and so we're going to help him do some. But other than that, I really have no information about the mental health.
Hi, thanks so much for your talk. So I'm a policy person, so I haven't had a lot of exposure to like metals and leaching issues. So that was really interesting. And you talked a little bit about cessation, but from a policy perspective, cessation is just really difficult. Once you're addicted, it's just really hard to quit. And from our current research, we know tobacco taxes tend to be the most effective in reducing consumption. And FDA deeming rule, maybe we're getting closer there, but also maybe not. What other policy or higher level interventions can we start thinking about to keep kids from starting?
Yeah, I don't know. I think this similar to this first question. I think we're gonna have to put our collective public health minds together, and mental health and intervention people, policy people, and just figure out what has worked maybe for cigarettes that we could possibly communicate to this younger population. But unfortunately, we all know when you're that age, you're invincible. And it's like, that's not gonna happen to me. And so even if you show conclusively that this is hexavalent chromium and in concentrations that could cause cancer in 20 years, they will laugh at you. It's like, 20 years, I don't care. Because it's the truth of it. So I don't know. I think, like Norma said, we're at the beginning of this, and hopefully FDA clearly was very slow and very, very bad, I think, at cracking down, but it looks like finally they're trying to do something, so we'll see what they're cracking down on flavors is doing and on this jewel, but it might be too late because there's already millions of kids addicted to the nicotine.
Is there any information about smokers or cigarette smokers who quit and switch to e-cigarettes? Does their lung health improve at all? Is there any positive effect of that?
So we only have, in our study, we have some anecdotal information. All of our previous smokers said that they would definitely feel better. They could increase their activity. They felt better. I don't know that I've read any conclusive clinical study or anything, but the people that were previous smokers swear that this works. And actually, I know of a couple of people that by reducing the content of nicotine in the electronic cigarettes, you can effectively wean yourself off of the nicotine and eventually stop. But you have to want to do it, and most people just don't want to do it.
So,
and because they feel safe now with the vaping, I think it's going to be harder now. Yeah.
I'll ask a question of Wayne, since he started this conversation here. What other chemicals would you track? Would it be carbon monoxide to actually confirm that there is a reduction in risk, say, for cardiovascular?
I think she's measuring quite a lot. I'm not sure what you would measure to look at that lung health, but I think it's going to be difficult, to curtail the e-cigarettes if there is this health benefit from all the, smokers. I mean, they're going to fight any regulations to cut back on e-cigarettes. So it's going to be a tough public health problem.
Yeah, I think that's why the policy strategy that was mentioned in the back is like, how do we get them to not even start? That's where we should put our efforts, I think.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I just want to know about the other side of the spectrum. So you said that young people are attracted to all these designs and the advertisement, and they start with e-cigarettes. Is there any study that says they're more likely to, they're more likely to switch to combustible cigarettes as a result of starting out from e-cigarettes as opposed to non-smokers who directly go to combustible cigarettes?
Yeah, this new research on JAMA, which I think I have, you can't see it. It's by King, I think, or anyway, it's in that slide at the very bottom, but I can't see it. But there's if you look at JAMA, just Google JAMA and I think juuling or vaping, and there's 3 or 4 in the last week alone, and one of them is conclusively exactly addressing that and conclusively saying they are switching to smoking. Yeah.
Well, thanks so much, Anna, for reporting all that you've done, and I know we'll
Thanks
stay
for the
tuned.
invite.